Hi knitting friends. In this video I am going to show you how to work Japanese short rows, both on the knit side of the work and on the purl side of the work. I've already worked 2 Japanese short rows right here, and I'm going to work another 2. The first one I'll work will be in English style, and then the second one will be in Continental style knitting. It's the same, they're done the exact same way, but just in case it helps you to see it in one type of knitting versus the other, that's fine. So here we go. I'm ready to work my Japanese short row. What I'm going to do here is I've worked up to the spot where I need to turn. I'm going to turn my work, and the first thing I'm going to do is slip the next stitch purlwise from the left needle to the right needle. Then I'm going to grab a stitch marker, a lock ring stitch marker, and put it on the working yarn. You'll see I already have some in my work from the other short rows that I've done. So I've slipped a stitch, I have a marker sitting on the yarn, and now I am going to purl the next stitch. I'm going to give that a little tug and purl the next stitch. Before I go much further, I want to make sure that that stitch marker is sitting right there on the working yarn between the slip stitch and the purl stitch, and there it is. So now I'm going to finish my row of purl and then turn around again. All right, so as I mentioned, the second short row that I work will be done in Continental style, just so that you can see what the technique looks like in the different styles of knitting. Again, Continental knitting and English style knitting both yield the same results. All right, so I'm here at the spot I want to turn. I'm going to turn the work. With my yarn in the front, I'm going to slip the stitch purlwise, the one that I turned on. Then I'm going to put a stitch marker onto the working yarn, clip that on. Make sure it's butted up against the right hand needle, and then at that point I am going to purl back across the row. What you want to make sure before you really go far is that you do have that stitch marker sitting on the strand between those 2 stitches there. Okay, so on this next row I'm ready to resolve my short rows. What that means is I'm ready to work across, and I'm going to close up the gaps that are a result of the short rows. So every time I turned around, I get this big gap on the needle where my rows are different heights from one another. So what I'm going to do here is knit up to the gap. So in this case, I'll be knitting these 3 stitches so that I am sort of teetering on the edge of the gap here. This is this huge space. What I'm going to do to resolve this short row is I'm going to grab onto my stitch marker and lift up this little strand right here, that little loop that was wrapped around my stitch marker. And I am going to insert my left hand needle from front to back into the left leg, in between those 2 legs of that loop. So let me move this out of the way for a second. I've got this loop right here. I'm going to insert my left hand needle right into that loop, and I'm taking off my stitch marker. Once I have that loop that had been marked on the left hand needle, I'm going to knit these 2 stitches together. So I'm knitting together the stitch that was at the bottom of the gap together with the stitch that had been on the marker. Okay, so now I'll show you that in English style. I'm going to knit up to my next gap. Right here at the gap, I'm knitting the stitch right before the gap. I'm going to lift up this loop. So I'm pulling my marker up. And once I have that loop, I'm putting it onto my left hand needle from front to back. So my needle is going into the loop from the front towards the back. You can remove the stitch marker, and then you're going to knit 2 together. The stitch that had been on the stitch marker with the stitch that was at the other end of the gap. All right, and we've got another 2 on this row for the knitted version of the Japanese short row. We'll show you the purl version in a moment. So here I am at another gap. I'm going to lift up that Oop, stitch marker just popped right off. That's great, because here's my loop. I'm going to insert my needle right into the loop and knit these two together, the loop with the stitch. So it's this loop that gets knit with the stitch at the bottom of the gap. So I'm knitting up to the gap, and I'll work this one continental style. I'm going to grab the stitch from the loop, put it on the left-hand needle. You can remove the stitch marker, and then you're going to knit these two together, the stitch with the loop. And those are your short rows. I'm going to purl a row back, and then I'll show you what it looks like. All right, here we are. I've got all of these little short rows completed. So you can see on this side of the work, I have fewer rows, less height, than on this side of the work where I had built up more short rows. So I'd worked, stopped here, come back. So I built up all this height, and everywhere where I had one of those Japanese short rows, the stitch is slightly bulkier, but not too bad. The back looks pretty good too. So now let's tackle purl. Okay, here we are. I'm ready to work a few more Japanese short rows. I've already put 2 on the needle right here. You can see I've got my little stitch markers waiting, ready with their respective loops. So I'm going to start with the continental style. I'm just purling. I work a Norwegian purl, a variation on the Norwegian purl here. Okay. So you get to the spot where you need to turn, and again, I'm purling on this row here. So I'm going to turn the work. My first step, just like in the knitted side of the Japanese short row here, is to slip the first stitch purlwise. And you'll notice my yarn is in the back. My yarn is to the wrong side of the fabric. So or the back of the fabric. So I've slipped that stitch over from the left needle to the right needle. I'm going to clip a stitch marker onto the working yarn, and then I'm going to hold onto the yarn and knit across the row. And before I finish that row, I'm just going to double check that I have my stitch marker resting between these 2 stitches, the slip stitch and the first knit stitch. All right. Now I'll demonstrate in English style. So here I'm going to purl until the spot where I need to work my Japanese short row, which in this case is 3 stitches before the gap. So right here, I am going to turn the work around. With the yarn at the back of the fabric, I'm going to slip the stitch over from the left needle to the right needle purlwise. So my needle is going down the stitches though I'm purling. Then I'm going to clip a stitch marker onto the working yarn and knit to the next step in the pattern, in this case the end of the row. And as I do it, I'm just going to verify that that stitch marker is resting on the strand between the 2 needles, between the stitches that are on the right-hand needle. Okay, now that I've gotten all of these short rows here, we're going to work on the resolution of them. And the resolution of them is a little bit different from the knitting resolution. And the reason being is that we're going to be doing a purl 2 together. So we want the left leg to lean over the pulled stitch. I'll show you how I get this to happen. We're going to purl to the gap. So the same way we did for the knitted side, we're purling to the space between these short rows. So what I mean by that is, like right here on the needle, there's a big gap. That's the spot you would purl to for the next one. So we've purled to this gap. What we're going to do is slide the farther stitch, the stitch at the other edge of the gap. We're going to slide that over to the right-hand needle and hold on to it there for a moment. While we're holding that there, we're going to lift up the bar that's held onto with that stitch marker. So I'm lifting the stitch marker and I'm going to insert my left-hand needle into that new stitch, and you can remove the stitch marker. So I now have that, what was marked on the little stitch marker on the left-hand needle. I'm now going to replace the stitch that used to be at the other edge of the gap onto the left-hand needle, just above that marked stitch, and I'm going to purl the two together. Okay. I'm going to keep purling now until I get to that gap. Here's the gap. I'm going to purl that last stitch. Then I'm going to slip over the far stitch on the other side of the gap. We're just holding on to it for now while we lift up this stitch here, the one that's marked on the marker, and slide that onto the left-hand needle. So again, we're just holding this stitch. Now we're going to move it back. And then you're going to purl those two together. This sets the stitches up in the correct position so that they won't be twisted and you don't get a weird ridge in the front of your work. So now I'm switching over to Continental style. Again, it's the same motions as the English style, or we're doing the same stitches. There's nothing different about how the stitches themselves appear. I'm going to slip the stitch from the left needle over to the right needle purlwise, lift up the stitch that's on the stitch marker, and slide that onto the left-hand needle. Then I'm going to replace this stitch on the left-hand needle onto the left-hand needle, and I'm going to purl these two together. So the marked stitch along with the gap stitch. So here we are at one more. I'm going to slip over the gap stitch. I am going to, with the yarn out of the way, I'm going to lift up the piece that's on the stitch marker and put it onto the left-hand needle. Then I'm putting that stitch that was on the right-hand needle back to the left-hand needle. And now I'm going to purl two together. And then, since that was my last short row, I'm purling to the end of the row. I'm going to knit one more row just so that you can see what it looks like with a little bit of space. Okay, so here we go. Here are our short rows. We have a smaller span of rows on this side and a larger span of rows on this side. There's about 10 rows here and only 3 rows there. And you can see each of these short rows has a nice bridge. There are no major gaps anymore between the differential rows, and it's fairly smooth. And on the back here, also nice and smooth. Happy knitting!